So here we go into the details of this. Although I'm going to go through these slides just kind of linearly, feel free to just jump in there, and if you've got questions, please, please, please ask, because if you have a question about something, guaranteed somebody else who is either in class right now or who is watching this recording will have the same question. So really all questions are welcome here. So what is a geographic information system, or a GIS? So basically it's a linked database and then map layers. So you can see here that you've got this record, right? You've got a particular shape. So it could be a city, it could be a zip code, it could be a state, it could be a county, but whatever is drawn here in the map is linked in here through a database, through a table, really. And so, you know, you can think about it as places. You could also think about this being patients. So each patient can, for example, have a medical record number or unique ID. We could have their name, their address, we could have their vital signs, we could have a number of biomarkers, diagnosis codes, etc. So you can really do this about places, you can do it about people, and you can do it about the environment. And that's all the different forms of spatial data we'll be talking about using in a GIS. But basically, if you click on any place in the map, and it'll highlight that particular record in the table, and then vice versa. So as you make edits to one, you make edits to the other, kind of live. So GIS can incorporate anything with location. And this is just a really quick kind of graphic of some of this is more like human and natural environment sorts of data, but really anything about the social belt or natural environments can be a layer, as well as anything about your patients. So your patients themselves, their geographic distribution based on their home address, you know, what does their access to care look like? What does, you know, health insurance coverage look like? What do cancer outcomes look like, etc. If you can dream it up, it probably has some locational component to it, which means that it then could be suitable and added into a GIS. And this is one of the real powers of GIS, and why it's really coming into clinical medicine, is because this is just an example of what, 3, 6, 7, 8 layers. You can put hundreds of layers together of different variables, link them to your patients, and then you can map and model those to kind of understand, you know, what's the prognostic value of some of these natural, social, built environmental features that our patients live in. You know, when we link all of it together, how can it help us clinically better understand their lives, and therefore how to deliver better care? So this is, again, it's the power of so many different variables from so many different domains being linked into patient data that is really driving a lot of this interest in GIS and clinical medicine. Okay, so, but this summer, and really every time I teach anything about GIS, I want to make sure that I just say to you at the outset that this is a lot more than just button pushing in a GIS. If you've Googled at all GIS or Arc Pro or any of the GIS software out there, there are a lot of YouTube videos about them, like how to do this type of map or that type of map or this type of analysis or that type of analysis. And those are helpful. They're very helpful for button pushing. So like, how do I need to set up my data? What buttons do I need to push in order to get X outcome? But none of it talks about the pre-work that has to be done in terms of understanding what are appropriate data sets. How do I set them up? How should I conceptually be thinking about them? You know, what might my hypotheses be, etc. And they absolutely don't talk about on the output end, like, how do I interpret this? How do I make sense of this? How do I fold this back into clinical decision making? None of that is there. So, you know, I really try to stress the spatial thinking and just thinking in general about what we're doing with GIS for our patients. And that to me always comes back to geography, because that is the disciplinary home for geographic information systems. And so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the idea and the reality that geography is not where places are. It's not the capitals of states and countries, although that's, I guess, a very small part of it. Sadly, in the US educational system, that's generally how we teach geography. But globally, geography is really conceptualized as the study of spatial relationships between humans and environment at or near the Earth's surface. And that last little part is important because if you get too far above Earth's surface, you're talking more about atmospheric issues, which would fall more into the realms of meteorology or climatology. If you're talking about too far below Earth's surface, you're really getting into the world of geology. So geography is really at that human environment interface. So again, anything with location usually can be studied in some geographical context. So this is kind of the big kind of thinking lens through which we're going to be approaching everything we look at this semester. This is a lot of text on a page, and you don't have to read all this text because I think you've already written it. You've already read it in the textbook because I put this in here. But I do like to remind you that in clinical medicine, the effective use of GIS is, I can't say always, I hate to say always because there's going to be somebody who proves me wrong with some case, generally always done in a collaborative environment. Generally, it's a part of team science. And that's going to just, I think really a lot of clinical medicine is that way. You're in teams. And that's for some very, very good reasons in terms of producing the best science, the best knowledge, and the best care for our patients. And so I always reference the poem, a very old poem now, called The Blind Man and the Elephant. And it just talks about how each of these people are, they can't see and they're all touching an elephant, but each one is touching a different part. And based on the one part that they're touching, they describe it very detailed. They're completely correct about what their observations are, but it's just one piece of a complex situation. And it's only when we can talk to each other and share what our observations are that we can actually create that entire complete picture that is where we need to go when it comes to patient care. So just a reminder that, again, and this goes back to the science being a human endeavor, each of you brings strengths and observations of your particular specialty, and as you move forward as well in your clinical practices. But keep in mind that that's one piece, and it can really help open your eyes when you can have the other pieces, and GIS can do that in terms of bringing in all those different types of layers and being a kind of a central shared resource, data resource for people from different specialties to collaborate. Okay, so again, this class is for exploration. I've said a lot of this already. Feel free to fail. You will fail. You're going to have data problems in your GIS. And by fail, I mean you're going to have little micro failures. Some data won't work. Something you tried won't work. I really think those are valuable learning experiences, and there's nothing you can do to break your computer or the GIS in this class with anything we do. So you feel free to click away. You may get error messages, you may get things that you didn't expect, you may get nothing, but all of that teaches you, and feel free to do that in this class. Again, you're not graded, so like, why not? Always, so using sandboxes and making backups, and you'll see how this makes sense when you actually get into the GIS next week. Whenever you're working on a project, I like to actually have two projects. One is my workspace where I get to try things out. And then the other is the final thing where I'm putting together the poster, the paper, the presentation. So a sandbox is basically that area where you can try and fail and try some more and fail some more, and then kind of test out what you want to do. And then when you're ready for that, just replicate that in the final kind of project that you're working on, okay? And then finally, making backups. You're going to see really quickly, GIS data is big. It has a lot of files. For even the smallest data, there are a lot of files. And so having backups of everything is really important. And then making sure that your backups are complete, and so that you have some other kind of location that mirrors your workspace. So whether you're using a Google Drive or you're using an external hard drive or whatever you do for a GIS project, I strongly suggest that you put all of the data in one or two, usually two, other places so that you always have it in case something happens, because you can have data corruption. There can be issues. I lost my master's thesis and all of my data like the week before I was defending. Something corrupted in one of the files and it corrupted everything, and I had to rebuild my master's thesis in a week because I did not back up. So I have a personal failure story on this one, and this is why I say it to you is do back up. Okay. And in terms of anything that you submit for class, I don't have deadlines. Fortunately, this isn't a graded class. I really don't like deadlines for students when you're learning something that's brand new to you, because everybody's going to learn at a different pace. So I'll just say this: when you do things, feel free to send it to me early and let me look at it and give you feedback. Or let's say you submit the final of whatever it is. I may return it to you with lots of comments. I generally do. And don't see that as like, you didn't do well. See that as like a step of growth, and just do the revisions and resubmit. I don't think that lots of comments is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's how learning happens. So just know that I'm pretty chill on that stuff, and just know when I send you a bunch of feedback, it's not because I hate what you're doing. It's because I love what you're doing, and I just want to see you be the best of yourself that you can be. So let's dive into just a quick history of mapping. Some of this you've already read in the textbook, but I just want to hit the high points for everybody, especially those who are watching this via recording. So kind of the origins, people often say that the origins of our modern use of GIS in clinical medicine and public health for sure really goes back to Dr. John Snow and the cholera epidemic in London in the 1800s. Have any of y'all read about this before? Some of you, yeah. Okay. So I'll tell you. So I've got a link here to it if you want to check it out. There's also I'll post this on the Google Drive. There's a YouTube video by the guy who wrote the book Ghost Map, which is about John Snow and the cholera epidemic in London. So the Reader's Digest version of this is that there's this cholera outbreak in London in the 1800s, and lots of people are dying, and they can't figure out this is before we understood how cholera works. This is in the time of really the theory was about miasmas, bad air causing a lot of disease, but people really can get a handle on what was going on. A lot of people are dying. And so again, the story goes that Dr. John Snow went walking around with a map, marking out to all the homes where, you knock on the door and ask, what was going on there. Had somebody died? And he marked it all out. And so he made this kind of map here, paper map of disease. And then he was able to figure out, again, so the story goes, that at the center of this geographic distribution was the Broad Street water pump. He takes the handle off the pump. Nobody can get water from there anymore. And lo and behold, cholera ends. He ended the epidemic by removing the access to the water. He was able to figure out it was the water that was causing it from this pump. It isn't that simple, that it didn't exactly happen that way, but it's a really lovely story about the power of mapping. And there's a lot to it that is relevant. It just wasn't quite that neatly sewed up. But John Snow is really considered the father, really, of epidemiology, the father of spatial epidemiology for sure. And a lot of people will link back to this when they talk about using GIS in clinical medicine. So I just wanted you to have that background. But what I also want to draw your attention to is that Dr. John Snow was also a person who really believed in listening to people. He was out in the field, so walking around London, listening to people. He was asking questions. He was listening to what people said, and he wrote it all down. It's not like he went in with a preconceived idea and just waited until he heard the answer he was looking for and wrote that down. He went and he listened and he documented. So really solid scientific thinking of, I'm going to be very curious and I'm going to ask questions. And when people are talking to me, I'm going to really deeply listen to what they have to say, and I'm going to write it all down because I don't know yet what exactly is going to be important. And so we forget I think often in the story, we forget the human side of it, the kind of soft skills and the qualitative side of actually what he did that led to this famous map that is, really a large part of why we're all sitting here today, even talking about this. So think about that as you move forward using GIS in the service of your patients and their care. It's really the importance of asking questions or making observations, asking questions, and really thinking deeply and listening to what people have to say in response. So from the 1800s, and this was done on paper, so you don't have to have high tech in order to use GIS. You can map on paper maps and do just fine for your patients too, in many ways. But starting in the 60s, we started to move forward with the GIS technology that we have today. It started, and this is actually really important. The first formal GIS was the Canada Land Inventory, from the Canada Land Inventory into the Canada Geographic Information System in the 60s. And the reason this is really important is that modern GIS was designed to manage and organize land use and land parcels. It was not designed for health. It was not designed for disease. It was not designed for people. It was designed for land and resources. And so the architecture of the software reflects those origins. Now, I will tell you also, there are a lot of conversations, and I'm fortunate to be a part of them, about redesigning GIS that's actually responsive to the needs of clinicians and patients and not so static and polygon based on land use. But that's very much a conversation that's still ongoing. So the origins of any technology always kind of have a trajectory and kind of filter through to its current versions, lending both strengths and weaknesses. So always knowing the history of science, the history of scientific technologies and approaches is really important because it informs what you're working with at the current moment. So one of the big limitations, and you're going to see this, I think, pretty quickly as we start to work with data over the summer, is that GIS is really designed to present static maps. So a snapshot in time over space. And then it's also really designed for the quantification of spatial relationships. So, clusters and hotspots. Great with those qualitative pieces that we were just talking about with Dr. John Snow. I will also tell you, I'm just going to go off camera for a second and save my bandwidth. I will also tell you that GIS does not always do so great in rural areas. And especially when we're looking at hotspots or clusters of disease or certain outcomes, the algorithms that are used to determine what is a cluster of cancer outcome or late stage diagnosis, et cetera, it's all been designed in like urban academic scientific centers. And so the population distribution in rural areas is really different. And so what constitutes a cluster or a hotspot or a meaningful geographic pattern in rural America is really different from urban America and not well captured by existing methodologies. So this is something that I think it started to arise. People started to realize this during COVID when they were looking for COVID clusters. And it's like, well, we don't see any in rural America. And it's not that it wasn't there. It's just that the distribution, the underlying population distribution is different. And then what constitutes a cluster and routes of transmission just looked really different. And we didn't do a very good job there. But it did raise awareness. And then that is another conversation I'm a part of, how we can adapt, learn from rural places to do a better job in detecting really meaningful health patterns so that we can intervene properly and as early as possible. So again, with GIS, the quantification has really been the focus, the quantification of spatial relationships. So this is what cluster detection can look like. You'll have an underlying population distribution of patients with, let's say, kids with elevated blood lead levels, or we can look at, stage 3 or 4 cancer diagnoses and something that really should have been caught by a screening. But we can do that as one layer, and it can give us very detailed, targeted locations where these outcomes are concentrated. It can be at a neighborhood level, like what we're seeing down here. And then here, it can even be, this is common too, any place that's like a multi-occupancy location, especially low income, so apartment complexes, public housing, etc. Oftentimes they'll show up as hotspots or clusters, not because there's something going on at the community level, but just because you have a lot of people in a building or in a very small area. So that can result in clusters. So you have to be very careful in kind of probing these clusters that are created through these quantification approaches. What also can be very powerful, though, is if you're running cluster detection of multiple different variables. What we often find is that there's a socioeconomic gradient with a lot of the negative health outcomes, the things we want to prevent. They often tend to cluster in the same places with the same people. So it's, where you have high food insecurity, you'll have high rates of diabetes, you'll have high rates of smoking, you'll have high rates of various forms of late stage diagnosed cancers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it can be kind of a sad, for me, it's always really sad to see that the same places are facing the same people are facing so many negative health outcomes. Honestly, it does kind of get to me because the maps don't change. But on a positive note, it also can inform our clinicians, especially those who are running like mobile units, healthcare. They can put a bunch of different resources and a bunch of different people on these mobile units. So when they go out to respond, they're hitting, 4, 5, 6 different health outcomes for improvement rather than just focusing on the one thing. It's sad, but GIS also reveals what's going on, and then that can lead to more robust, holistic interventions. So, but again, what we were just looking at are static maps. So those clusters were just set in space at one particular time. And really what we know is that the environment and also people are actually quite dynamic. We don't sit there in one place, and the environment doesn't stay the same. It's not the same at all locations at all times of day. So just as a really dramatic example of this, looking at issues of air quality, you can see that, and this is just an example from Google Maps, and it's probably a little bit dated by now, but basically there's a lot of mobile monitoring going on now. You can do it with air pollution, you can do it with noise pollution, you can do it with green space, leaf cover, temperature, etc. But you can notice even how block to block, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood, environments change. And that over the course of time of day, they can change, and day of week and season. So the environment is actually quite variable. A variable, a dynamic variable. But people are too, which we'll get to in just a second. So this is a great example. This is from one of my former students, Laura Hsu, Dr. Hsu. And this was work we did with Akron Children's Hospital here. And we were looking at elevated blood lead levels. And what we realized is that, and this was in a fairly low income population, what we realized is that these kiddos are in families that are on the move quite a bit. So this is what's called residential history or residential mobility. And that because you've got low income, usually high renter populations and high eviction populations, they can have multiple home addresses in the electronic health record over the course of a year. So these tend to be relatively short moves within a city or within a county, but they're moving. And so if you are using a patient home address to then look at their surrounding environment, or trying to identify clusters of a particular outcome, you need to know that there's a fair percentage of your population that probably isn't at that one point for that long, months or a few years, and then they're moving again. So and that's very different from more educated, higher income populations. And you can see this in data from the US Census and a lot of research in demography. People who have higher income levels, and higher educational levels, kind of the two often, but not always go hand in hand, they'll have a few big moves in their lives. So moving to college, moving back home, moving to wherever their first job is. Maybe they'll move again to a second job, but they don't move that much, but they do move a few times long distances. It's a very different pattern in the lower income population. They tend to move frequently, but short distances within their community. So as a clinician, thinking about the patients you serve, you always, although you're going to be given their current address, just keep in mind that any address you are given as a clinician, that's going to be given based on billing. Okay, that's their billing address. And it's meant for that purpose. It's not meant for you to have a better insight about their health. So you will see that it can sometimes be a post office box, which does not go onto a map, because that's just a post office. So that doesn't do you any good. But also, whatever that one address is, know that you should usually ask for all the other addresses that they might have given when they come in for a clinical encounter, and don't delete those. So even if you are just doing it in an Excel spreadsheet in your own clinic, this does not have to be high tech. Always make sure you don't just delete and overwrite previous addresses. Keep a list of it so you can actually see where your patients are moving, because that informs clinical care as well in terms of where you're going to allocate resources. And then you can also bring in wraparound care. So you can bring in social services, clinical social workers, et cetera, who can help with housing stability, food security, et cetera. So what all of this has led to is then, rather just a home address, we're starting to move to this idea of what's called an activity space. So that the normal places that you go over the course of a day. So rather than one point on a map, maybe there's a smaller polygon on a map. So where you live at home, where you go to work, school, daycare, groceries, faith-based activities, athletic activities, whatever it may be, we all have some form of daily or weekly activity space. So this is starting to be used, in addition to just a patient home address, to get a better sense of the environments that they may be exposed to that are shaping their health. And then also there's the question of time and when. So we can think about the temporal component over the course of a day, a week, seasonally, years. We can also think about it over a patient life course, though, because there are certain time points in a person's biology when they are going to be more affected by their surrounding environment than others. You can think about prenatally, you can think about early childhood, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of work now doing work on life course trajectories to try to figure out, especially looking at issues like dementia. So at what point were different people exposed to what sorts of environments that may be shaping neurological health? So a whole other area, a whole other component, thinking about place and time and how it affects our biology and our health. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. There's a lot going on here, but I do just want to say that there is quite a bit of work, and it's fascinating. I work with colleagues who do it, but it's not specifically what I do on a daily basis. But actually looking how the social environment, so if you want to think about exposure to stressors and allostatic load, as well as the like air quality environment, might actually be shaping epigenetics. So thinking about DNA methylation, thinking about telomere length, all sorts of things that are going on that are just really the microbiome, the mycobiome, etc. So there's a lot of work now being done using GIS to actually map these patients, their residential mobility, their food intake, the air they're breathing, and then how is this actually changing us in a variety of microbiological ways, which is pretty fascinating. So we're only going to use, though, GIS, despite all of the depth of what's going on in the research world. It really comes down to just a few tools that we use, or a few, I'd say, kind of suites of tools, and then just a few data types. So we will be using a number of geospatial technologies. Geographic information systems is one of them, but part of that is also remote sensing. We'll look at that a little bit, especially when you're reading, when you get into section 2 on data input. So remote sensing is what we can get primarily from satellite-based data. And it used to not be very good, but it is actually quite good now. There's been a lot of investment in NASA and private industry. We do a very good job understanding green space and air quality and temperature and how all of this shapes human health via remotely sensed technology. We've got some really interesting mobile technologies, which you just saw the example of the Google Street View car, but there's a lot of mobile work being done because GPS, right? GPS is in all of your smartphones. It's in your smartwatches. So all of that data that might be collected on your smartwatch, it's also tied to a coordinate. So we know when your heart rate spikes, where were you? What was going on at that particular place? So there's a lot that's being done with mobility via GPS and then how it shapes human biology and behavior. We use spatial analysis, so it's a particular form of quantitative analysis of these data, but we'll also talk a little bit about some of the more spatial mixed methods and qualitative approaches too. Finally, all of this data that we have really gets reduced into either points, lines, polygons, or grid cells. Those are the 4 data types we use in a GIS. So, points could be an address, lines could be a road, polygons could be a county or a city, grid cells, that's usually for remotely sensed data, which is continuous data. So those are just the small squares or rectangles in which we chop up space for measurements, often from satellite and other sensors. A few quick, you don't have to read all of this. I put this in here because I always want you to think about the data you're using. Most of what you'll do, at least from an introductory perspective in GIS, is using official data sets. So that can be data from the US Census, data from NASA, data from Georgia Department of Public Health, et cetera, but it's going to be some secondary data set that has been collated and provided for you. And there are always a lot of questions that you should be asking of it. It's accepted as the official truth, and it is helpful and certainly convenient, but there are a lot of holes in it too. And so you always want to ask questions and be curious about that data you're using in a GIS. Is it complete? Where might the uncertainty be? How stable are these hotspots? Because a lot of these official data sets do not take into account residential mobility. It's just where was the patient living when they got that cancer diagnosis, for example. So there are a number of questions you want to think about as you go through using the data sets, okay? So again, anything with location is spatial data and can be integrated in a GIS. So although we'll start with official data, that does not have to be where you stay, and it doesn't have to be where you end. You can bring in anything you want to. As an example of that, and this gets more into spatial biology, even parts within the human body can be mapped in a GIS. Not usually in QGIS like we're using, but there are now some GISs developed more for spatial biology. So we can get as macro or as micro as you want to get with this. I'm going to just run through this last bit quickly because I want to get to the end here and open up for questions. But, I work a lot on local knowledge of spatial data. So this is actually like, how do people see their environment? Where do they feel safe or not? Which was the example I shared with you in my intro. But also, and this is where I think it gets really interesting, what do they know, this idea of humans as sensors of their own environment, what do they know about where they live that you don't know and won't know as a clinician? So for example, this is a project I did with Chicago Public Health on a health impact assessment. This was a few years ago. This was a low income, high negative health outcome neighborhood of Chicago, and they were doing a rails to trails conversion, taking this old unused rail line and turning it into an outdoor physical activity resource. Well, we gathered pedestrian crash data, so where cars had hit people, from the Illinois Department of Transportation, sorry, and we ran one of those cluster detections. So we had a whole map full of points. We ran this spatial cluster detection, and it showed that it was really this segment of roads where we were having a high concentration of pedestrian crashes. And that was important to us because then we wanted to know, okay, so this is when you have scarce resources, where do you want to allocate them for the intervention? Where do we need to make crossing into the trails more safe for the people so they actually use the trail and get the benefit of the outdoor physical activity? So, but we had a hunch that this was really not the only problem. And so we used that local knowledge mapping with Chicago Department of Public Health and people who lived in this neighborhood. And we just asked them, we gave them a paper Google map and said, okay, you tell us all the places where you don't feel safe crossing the street, because we want to make sure that you feel safe getting in to use this trail. And sure enough, there was only one of the places they identified. We ran cluster detection on their data too. But the only place that aligned with the Illinois Department of Transportation, the official data, was this one area. Identified all of these other places where they said they did not feel safe crossing the street and they would not want to cross in to use the trail. And not only was it just, I don't feel safe here, but we also asked them why. And for many of them, they had either been hit, like grazed very lightly, or they had had a number of near misses. So if you think about what it actually takes to end up in a pedestrian crash data set, it has to be pretty severe. Like it has to have been so bad that they had to call the police, somebody was injured, et cetera, et cetera. But these people, through their local knowledge, living in the community, they knew that people got grazed or had near misses all the times at these places. So that was really important local knowledge that we needed that actually then changed our intervention for the rails to trails. So again, caution with your official data sets. They are helpful and convenient. They will probably have their limitations, and you'll probably want to ask questions about it, and you'll probably want to add in some additional data. I've done similar things here with child pedestrian injuries that I worked on, again, years ago. These were the hot spots. Sadly, it was just in one area, one part of the city, where kids were repeatedly over the course of many years being hit. And so what we did, instead of going and asking the community, we went to, and this is through Akron Children's Hospital, we went to the police officers who serve in these communities and asked. So we printed out this big map of the hot spots and we walked it over to the police department and laid it on the floor. And all the officers came over and they actually wrote down or told us why kids were getting hit at these different intersections. And it was different for the different ones, but this was, a lot of it had to do with the bus shelter, it was too small to fit them all. And so they would like roughhouse and push each other out into the street. Kids would get hit walking over, crossing the street to McDonald's when they got out of school. And so we were able to come up with some really like targeted micro interventions to address the causal mechanisms in these places. But that came from just sitting down and asking, this is very John Snow, asking some questions about the map and listening to what people said and valuing their local knowledge and experience, which led to the interventions that were very place-based and evidence-based as well. So finally, if there are a couple of things that I think are helpful to read along the same lines of what we just talking about, this critical thinking about how to use GIS. How to Lie with Maps by Mark Bonmanier. It's classic and it's short, which is why I always recommend it to people. And it's kind of entertaining. Like you could sit down over the course of an hour or two on a Saturday and just blow through it. And it's kind of fun, but it also helps you think. Ground Truth, I will just be honest with you and tell you, is not fun to read at all. I was forced to read it in graduate school. It just bored me to tears and made me want to pull my hair out. But I'm actually grateful I did it because it really changed the way that I thought about the use of technology and how we're representing people and their lives and their health. So it's, again, not a fun read, but it can be insightful. So finally, as we're kind of coming up to the end here, I'm just going to a few slides, again, more on this line of critical thinking. And then I promise you, so I I feel like always in these intro lectures, I scare students and then they're terrified to make a map because they're like, oh, I'm thinking about all the problems and all the things I'm missing. Um, Dive in and we're going to do it anyway, and then we'll talk about where the gaps might be. But say, for example, here, this is some of my work just after Hurricane Katrina, and there was a lot of building of playgrounds in New Orleans to try to entice people to come back. And so we mapped out all of the playgrounds, which is an asset, a kind of one component of asset mapping. And then we just mapped out what's called a buffer, so a walkable distance from the playground, so like 800 meters or something like that. And then we just classified each of the little census blocks, so little city blocks, as either being within access, walkable access to a playground, or beyond it. And if you use if you use the official data on where the playgrounds are, and you use this one widely accepted quantitative approach of classifying who does and doesn't have access to something, it actually looks like most of the city of New Orleans has pretty good access to playgrounds. Don't look at all of this. This is Lake Pontchartrain up here, so not that, but all of this down here. It actually looks like most of the city, you'd say, hey, this is looking good. Like families should move back because their kids have plenty of access to play spaces. But because I worked on the ground there, so this is an example of one of the new playgrounds that was built after Hurricane Katrina. But if you go into these playgrounds and just turn your back and look around, it actually was pretty desolate. Like nobody was around. Lots of mosquitoes. There was a lot of overgrowth. You don't see it as well here, but and still a lot of degraded, damaged buildings with a lot of still standing floodwater. So it was both like socially and environmentally not safe. So no, of course nobody had come back. Nobody had come back and they weren't putting their kids on these playgrounds. Because even though that one map quantitatively looked like conditions were good, when you got down to actually what's going on the ground, kind of ground truthing it, going back to the John Pickles book, when you ground truthed it, you realize it was really a different situation. And of course, nobody was back. And of course, there were never kids playing on these playgrounds. So you always, again, that critical thinking piece about what's going on. And this is my daughter. She'll cringe. She's 14, about to turn 15 now. But this is one of my pictures of her when we lived in LA. And we had a similar issue with our playgrounds because we had a number of people who were experiencing homelessness, and they would sleep in the playgrounds overnight. But then that also meant that so we had great access to playgrounds. But if you went first thing in the morning, there would be just a number of items left behind that really weren't safe for children. But you wouldn't know that if you just looked at that quantitative map of access to playgrounds. You're like, everybody should be at the playground playing. There's so much great access to physical activity. But when you actually go there, your kid picks up stuff that you absolutely don't want them picking up. And then no, you don't go back and use the playgrounds anymore. So these are really simple, high-level examples of how you really have to think about that official data, and you really want to ground truth whatever it is you're doing. This is just one more example here. This is from Cleveland, and I just did this in Google Street View. Again, we were looking at where kids have access to play space outside, and this is one of the playgrounds. But even just driving it on Google Street View, you can see it may be a playground, but all the swings have been removed and there's nothing to play on. So yes, quantitatively, this asset or resource is present, but for all practical purposes for human behavior and health promoting behavior, it's not there at all. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is thinking about how you present your maps. This is an idea called counter mapping. And this is from one of my colleagues in Louisiana, Dr. Charles Flanagan. So this is an example of how you can tell the truth many different ways in a map, okay? And this goes back to Mark Mamagne's How to Lie with Maps. So this was an environmental justice kind of study. And this map right here is from an environmental impact assessment. So in South Louisiana, where I went to graduate school, there's a lot of, this was a polyvinyl chloride plant. There are a lot of different plants that have toxic emissions, carcinogenic emissions. And there was another one, Shintech, that was proposed to be built here. And so as a part of their environmental impact assessment, they had to say, well, this is where the proposed plant is going to go, and this is how many people are going to be affected, okay? So I just want you to think about how they mapped it. The plant is a point, it's tiny, and it's green. The boundary of their fence line is blue. The 1 mile zone, again, is green. And then the population that they would be affecting, okay, is listed here, okay? How would you say this looks? Does this look like it's going to have a big impact or not a big impact? I'll do the spoiler alert. It looks like it's not a big impact. It looks like, oh, this doesn't look bad at all. Like it's just this little point and it's just these few people. So counter mapping then, Dr. Flanagan went, he actually asked the community to present their map of what they thought was going on. And this is what it looked like. So what they did is instead of making this plant the center, they made their school and their Head Start the center. So they changed the focal point of the map. And then they changed the context. So they added the Shintek, but they also showed all of the other plants that are in the area. And they put the proposed air emissions from the Shintek plant, and they put the actual emissions from the surrounding plants. And they put it over color imagery and. So the point is both maps are true. Both tell the truth of what's going on. Both are accurate, but they give you a very different picture of what's going on. So that is really the last thing I want to leave you with is that the way you decide to map that official data or the primary data you collect, it can have a very different effect on the message that you're communicating with a map. And that's, I think, especially important with mapping because if you think about statistical modeling, not that many people can read and interpret. If you're thinking about scientific writing or clinical scientific writing, not that many people are going to read it. But everybody feels some comfort with looking at a map, especially if it's a map of their home. It's accessible to them. And so I think people read into it more than they would some of our other products that we might produce as scientists or clinicians. So I always want you to just think about like, what am I actually showing here? And what might its impact be? And what might be some alternative ways that we could show our data? Okay, so that's where I wanted to leave it for today. All of the big thinking stuff to just make you aware before you start driving a GIS, which will start next week. So for next week, I would say go ahead and if you haven't finished section one, finish section one and start the first chapter of section two, which I think is chapter 4. So just incrementally go. If you want to go further, you can. And if you want to just do that, just do that. But that is going to be enough, I think, to get you ready. Download and install your QGIS because we will start playing with data next week. And if you've had any problems with the download, hang out, let me know, or set up a separate Zoom with me so you can screen share with me and we can kind of troubleshoot and figure out what's going on because you will need your QGIS starting next week. Anybody have anything? Questions? That was a lot without any breaks for questions or comments. So I don't enjoy that style of data dump, but sometimes you just have to get through the content. Nothing? Okay. Well, if you don't have any questions, feel free to drop off and I'll see you next week. And if you do want to hang out and if there's anything you want to talk about or anything you want me to look at, feel free to do that too. Okay. Okay.